missing all the detail on this guy.
Doctor, I just want to remind you that you are still under former oath.
Thank you, Mr. Lord.
Yes, Mr. Bani.
As the court pleases. Dr. Nada, I wonder if we can return to figures 4 and 5 and complete the description of the injuries on the deceased as you have depicted them in these figures.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, my Lord. At this juncture, I started with the wounds over the upper back. I'm moving downwards because it's probably most convenient to do so from my diagrams. I wish at this point in time to point out that from the records on the face, on the scalp, on the sides of the face, there were no recorded injuries, and of course none that we could see, that I could in my evaluation see on the few pictures of the face. We don't have too much of the face. However, I wish to, and I probably would return to the point that the post-mortem examination found that there was extensive, and the pathologist used the word extensive, scalp bruising over the scalp from front backwards and along the sides. The description is broad in that it describes general scalp bruising, and I'm not too sure if I should delve into it or later on.
You don't have to go into the detail because
Okay.
we will be returning to look at specific injuries.
Okay,
Yeah.
certainly. But that would be then, just to tie that up, signs of injury to the scalp, at least to the head and top and sides, and possibly front. At this juncture, thank you. I then would move on to another photograph which shows the particular bruise over the left upper arm, and yes, okay, this is a very good photograph. I'm not sure if this shows it as well as photograph 827. 827.
Doctor, you can remove your mask if you want to.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you. I thought we could just go to 827. And yes, that actually shows it very well. It's an upside down photograph. Oh, sorry. How do I cancel that? Sorry.
Can you help me?
Sorry, Advocate. Sorry about that. Thank you. So I point to this injury on the inner front of this arm, and it's got the appearance of the semicircular, crescentic, or horseshoe injury. Very much that like is seen on the top of the left foot, and I've seen this where as a patterned imprint abrasion or a braided bruise, a pattern, and I've seen it with metal pipes, metal or any sort of pipe that gives you a semicircular edge if applied at an angle, or I've seen it with the heel of a foot or the tip of the toe of the shoe, sorry, the heel of the shoe or the tip of the sole of the shoe. So I've seen it in those contexts. There possibly can be other causes. Any patterned object that is driven against the skin like that, it has to be of significant force to cause that amount of bruising. Thank you. Then, if I kindly go back to my diagram. Sorry, thank you so much for helping me with this. Thank you. So I move on to the back, and I point to the core. I point to an injury over that was not recorded. It's at the right mid-back. That was not recorded, and I'm pointing to that. It is a series of 3 transverse linear abrasions in a line and 2 small linear abrasions that are not recorded in Professor Gordon's report. Now, I think it's important to just show that injury there, and we can look at page number 828. 828. Right back, yes, you're there. The one above, yes. And of course, the body is lying on its right side, and there one can see it. One can see a series of, well, not too very clear on this one, but there are a series of 3, 1, 2, and another one here, 3 linear abrasions across the back, as well as two focal bruises. Obviously, with the hue and the color, because of the shading, I don't blame someone for thinking this might be reddened bruising, but because the body is lying on its back and it's after death, this photograph was taken at the mortuary, I think possibly at Dr. Biggs's examination at the mortuary here in Pietermaritzburg, and therefore we mustn't mistake this all for bruising. So those are 2 specific clear abrasions. They are patterned because they 3 in a line, at least. They are patterned, and that is usually implies an object or a structure that impacted, either the body impacted on it or something impacted against the body. And then if we look at, and I respectfully ask to go to maybe directly to photograph 824, which is just above that. Yes, there you are. This is an upside down. Maybe we'll start with the one at the bottom. Yes. Oh, thank you. Excellent. This is a right-sided view. It's the lower portion of the back, and what you see is the lower back here. Sorry. Yes, you see the lower back, the shoulder blades, that will be the middle of the back. This is the lower back, and that's the upper portion of the buttock. You can see the buttock cleft, and that's the area of the hips. So what we're seeing here at the top here are abraded bruises. There are about several there, but also there is an incision made, and like here, and also at the right hip and the right knee, those incisions were clearly, it's typical, it's the same way that we make those incisions ourselves for histology. So we take tissue biopsy sections, so clearly that was done. It's there and there. These were not sutured afterwards. It should be proper to suture them, but they weren't. clearly that they were striking bruises, otherwise you wouldn't have selected them. And there are more abraded bruises in the left side, as well as over the sacral prominence. And there are scattered other ones, and of course here there's a few scattered finer ones that can't be seen, can only be seen on a closer view, at least the screen that I can see here. Yes, smaller abrasions and abraded bruises. What I'd like to point out here, I hope I'm not going too fast for your lordship, is that part of the body is a recess. It is not even an area that touches the chair when you sit down in a chair upright. It's a recess. It's the concave sunken in recess of the body. It is not an area that will normally generally be struck as a result of a fall or even bumping against objects, etc. I find that the only time I find injuries here, in my experience, are those that are due to assault. So it's very unlikely to get an injury. Even in a motor vehicle accident where a body is rolling on the road, it's very unlikely that you get injuries in this region. Well, even at the hips as well. So I think that's something one needed to point out. And then, if I may go to my diagrams again.
Doctor, before you move
Sorry.
to the diagrams, you mentioned that the very prominent injury on the lower right above the buttocks, as well
Yes.
as the injury just to the top on the left, that those were incisions for purposes of histology tests.
That's correct.
But you mentioned that normally they would be sutured up, so that when the body is returned to the family, it presumably isn't. It's in a not in a messy state, so
Yes,
to
correct.
speak.
It's
So-
restored as best as possible.
Exactly, which would have been presumably the respectful thing to do.
Yes.
So why do you think in this case those wounds were not suited up? It's not a particularly big job to do.
Yes. My instinctive reaction is simple lack of commitment, or a bit of callousness. At that stage, if I may say, at 1977, it was while I was still getting out of high school into university, but I know that the police, I subsequently went into the forensic medicine department, and the police were running the police mortuaries, forensic mortuaries throughout the country, and I know from personal experience that the consideration of human rights and compassionate care of the bodies was not in place at that time. There was little finesse or little care. And it was one of the reasons that it was taken, the mortuaries were taken out of the police and placed under the health department. I am not saying that the situation is improved now, and that's not what I'm saying. Regretfully, it hasn't really. But that was the situation then.
Right.
A bit of callousness.
Would it have been the responsibility of the presiding pathologist or the other mortuary staff to do the suturing?
No, unfortunately not. The pathologist is so focused on his work, and he expects that to be followed. There was this dichotomy. The pathologist was in charge of the medical examination, whilst the police were in charge of the keeping of bodies. So we, as pathologists, had little control. You could create a little bit of concern, but you had no authority to overrule the police and how and where they did their work.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No problem. Thanks. If I could go to continue on my diagrams again. Thank you. If I may go to the following set of diagrams, the next two. Yeah. These are the lateral views, and if you see there, we just want to look at the lateral view of, and oh yes, look at the injury at the right iliac crest, which is there. That is the hip bone on the side, and we can at the same time look at the right right and left elbow injuries. If we look at the right hip and the right elbow, perhaps photograph number.
You know, just for the record, these are figures 6 and 7 on page 5 of Dr. Naidu's report.
Yes.
So, thank you. Photograph page 8 to 8, sorry, 8 to 8.
Dr. Naidu, while we are finding that photograph, am I correct in saying that these are injuries that are not visible from the front or back view?
From the... Sorry, just repeat that.
So, in figures 4 and 5,
yes,
we were shown a front view sketch of the deceased and a back view sketch.
That's right.
And in figures 6 and 7, we are shown side views.
That's correct, yes.
So my question is, the injuries on the side views are not visible on the previous sketches, so these are new injuries you're pointing out?
To an extent,
injuries, rather.
To an extent, I think the ones on the elbow can be seen on the front back view as well as the side view. The ones on the elbows.
Okay.
Yes. And perhaps I could refer to no.
Yes, if you could just indicate if any of these are the same we've seen previously or
yes,
or different.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you. This photograph shows a very good picture of the elbow next to the next to the hip. So the right elbow shows a cluster of injuries, quite strangely clustered. I'm not too certain if I look at the number of injuries, but they found as a circle of interrupted little bruises around the elbow, and also there's one on the lateral aspect of the elbow. Okay, so don't worry about the shading here and the shading there. And at the same time, I point out to the post-mortem incision across the right hip. That was the section of skin that was removed by Professor Gordon for histology. Perhaps there might be another picture, because this can also be seen on a back view photograph. And may I kindly just see if I can see the right elbow again. Now, I cannot see that, except that if one went to my diagrams again, sorry again for that. Maybe this is the diagrams, well, not the pictures, the diagrams.
It's a diagram.
Yeah. Yes, there. I'd like to just point out to the court, if one looks at the rear of the right elbow, we saw it from the side, and the rear of the left elbow, both have that identical pattern, as well as the front of the right knee. So the rear of each elbow and the front of the right knee, particularly, just those three areas, had this circle cluster of interrupted abraded bruises. And I'm just going to cross-reference to Dr. Biggs's examination of these wounds. He examined those on the legs, but on the knees, but they would also apply to the elbows. And he found that they were these imprints that he thought were like compressing lead seals. And if I just drew your worship's notice to what it meant was, if one recalls the way seals were done by the post office, in the older days, they would use this wax and have an imprint. It's almost like when you take a coin, when mum was making dough, you played with dough and used a coin to form a negative impression, so neat and so good looking. This is imprints on seals, wax seals, imprints of whatever you place against it. So that's what he was looking at around the elbow and the knees.
Dr. Nadu, am I correct in saying that the reference by Dr. Biggs to these compressed lead seals is at page 794 of volume B? My lord, that's volume B3.
Yes.
At page 794.
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct. That was exactly it. And my lord, I just referred to somewhere just past the mid portion of the paragraph. He talks about the type used to compress lead seals onto string or wire. Very similar to the wax seals that were used as well. So that's the kind of impressions, the well-demarcated impressions that he saw on the skin, and that perplexed him so much at that stage.
So that could only have been caused by some kind of instrument?
Patterned, yes. A patterned shape of instrument, yes. I have seen it in like a hot branding iron, but more often I've seen them with electrical injuries, and where the shape of the electrode is patterned against the compressed abrasion.
So are you suggesting that this could have been as a result of some kind of electrical application, electric shock treatment?
I think that's very possible, yes.
If I can just refer you to that same report, Dr. Naidu, on page 794. I don't know if you have it with you.
Yes, I do.
Dr. Biggs says, he starts off, this is a report titled, Investigation carried out in an attempt to explain the unusual marks observed on the body of Dr. Haffejee. It's dated 11th November 1977. And he starts off by saying, by clinical exclusion, it could be with confidence stated that these lesions were not. And he says, ordinary heat burns. In your view, that doesn't necessarily exclude electrical shock treatment?
Yes, it doesn't exclude electrical shock treatment.
Thank you.
Although Dr. Biggs could not recreate that with applying electric current, I'm not sure why. I'm not sure about the amperage or voltage of electrical current that was used. But one cannot exclude it.
Noted.
To go back to the sequence on the diagrams, if I may, go to the one we were using. Thank you very much again. And one can see that there is a side view appearance on the side of the elbow there, on the left elbow. And I did mention it was almost a mirror image, well, almost a mirror image of what is seen on each elbow. And then on the left hip, there's just a single injury. It's vaguely apparent, and I believe that's also a missed injury. It was an abraded bruise and seen on photograph on page 827. Yes, there were. Yes, there is. Yes, basically what it is this is the you can see this is the left hip. Is this the? Bear with me a moment. Yes, this is the left hip, the side view, and you can see the abdominal wall, the lower abdominal wall in front. Here, the lower abdominal wall, you can see the hip bone, the anterior and superior and anterior inferior iliac spines, and there's the buttock, and there is the sulcus. This is the little, we call it a sulcus. It's a little depression on the side of the hip, between the buttock and when the thigh, the trochanter ligaments begin. So you can see it's actually slightly a recess. If you think of the hip being a prominence, it's the hip bone area's prominence. That's the recess, and there's a bruise in that position.
So the depression, doctor, or that marked indentation where the cross is that a natural depression?
Yes, that's a natural depression. Everyone has it. When they stand up and maintain an upright posture, it's a little natural depression, and there is a bruise in that position. There appears to be a bruise in that position.
The evidence will disclose that he may very well have been subject to these mule kicks.
Yes.
Could that possibly have been the result of a mule kick?
Yes, it could be. I also like to think that, and which I will come to, being the mule kick is the understanding that I have is a kick from the back. It's a mule kick. It could also be a kick from the front, but when a horse or mule kicks, they kick backwards, and that's a total. It's almost like a sucker punch, unexpected. And I would have liked to think that the one to the abdomen and the chest could be mule kicks. One to the abdomen and possibly one to the chest. But yes, you can also get that with a mule kick to the left hip as well. We go on to the next injury, which is the front of both knees, and maybe on my diagram, just the front and back views, just adjacent. So yes, the front of both knees, and one can see the knees. Over the right knee, there's this clear circular pattern, a cluster again over the right knee. Over the left knee, there is a scattered set, but no circle cluster like we've seen. So strangely, it's over. That pattern is reproduced here. That we see on each elbow tip. That is reproduced on the right knee front, but not on the left knee. It probably, I'm not too sure how we can explain that. And I think the diagrams we can see there are 825 and 826, the photographs, sorry, 825. Yes, there is, and you can see this is a bit of a slight side view. That's the incision by Professor Gordon to remove a little bit, and there it is, the cluster. And there is another pattern, I think, on some other image that shows it as circling the front of the knee. I'm not too sure. Do you have another image that shows the... Yes, but that could be... Who does it? Yes. Well, it's not as continuous like I seem to think I've seen it, but certainly on the the right side, or on the lateral side of the knee, there's this semicircular concentric area. A little bit has been altered because of this post-mortem incision anyway. And then, of course, when you look at you can see on the front of the left knee, which I'm pointing to here, there is that abrasion, and there's also some on the outer aspect. Thank you very much for that, Advocate. You can see it on the outer aspect of the knee as well, left knee. Thank you. So there is, on the shin, there is an injury on the shin that was not recorded as well, with the inner aspect of the right shin. Yes. Is that word? Yes, there are linear abrasions here that were not recorded. Okay. And the inner aspect of the right knee. I can't recall whether I've made a note of these on the inner aspect of the right ankle, but certainly on the outer aspect of the right ankle. You can check that. Anything on the outside, right ankle? Thank you. Wow. These are what we call pinhead abraded bruises. This was recorded by. The strange thing is that some of these smaller ones were recorded, but some of the bigger ones were overlooked on the right ankle. And then on the dorsum of the left foot, if you can see the upper side.
Just to interrupt you momentarily, so these injuries on the outer and inner ankle, what typically could cause those injuries?
Again, any blunt force, but small focal lesions are usually produced by some sort of patterned instrument or area. So it wouldn't be, it could be falling onto gravel, but then I'd expect gravel injuries to be on the knees, the prominences that strike the ground, not the recesses of the ankle. So you want to exclude gravel. So you want to think about things that were applied to the body, either usually, and it wouldn't be by force, it would be local application. And I'd like to think that some things were applied to this area. I was thinking of shackling of some sort, shackling of the ankles, I can't exclude that, tying of the ankles together and around, like in some cases they do it around a pole, in cases where when people are in detention, I've seen it, or the application of electrodes.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if you can go back to the. We're covering this fairly well, but I've clustered it. If you can go back to my diagrams, please. Thank you very much. I'd like at this stage to draw attention to the back of both knees. And here, perhaps I'll first describe it. What hasn't been recorded in Prof. Gordon's report are two linear abrasions. They're almost parallel over the back of the knee. Okay, back of the left knee. Two linear abrasions can be seen on photograph 822. But before you move there, on the back of the right knee, you can see the incision. I've marked out the incision Prof. Gordon's made over a long and linear abrasion as well. Photograph 822 will. There you are. Do you think you can swap it? This is the top of the body is on the right side, and the feet are on the left. Yes. That's great. That's a good swap. And this injury, well, over the rear of the right knee, the incision can be seen, but one can see. One can see abrasion. Oh, actually, the incision has masked the abrasion over the right knee, and Prof. Gordon describes it as a linear abrasion, and I believe it was maybe nine centimeters long. But what was not recorded are two linear abrasions, and these are two, mind you, that I see on my close view, one that you can see and another fainter one there. They're both parallel, and I just need to draw at this stage attention to the fact that the backs of the knees are really traumatized. It's really traumatized in the backs of the knees, in falls or motor vehicle accidents, and drunken falls, and in assaults, etc. One does not see the backs of the knees as being traumatized. And if you remember the schoolboy prank that we used to play when we used to come behind one another, at least the boys' prank, and bump your ankles, bump your knees at the back, your automatic response is taken totally unawares is that you tend to drop. Now, that might have been a distraction from me, but I just wanted to draw the point that the backs of the knees are not usually involved, and I'm thinking that we must look at another specific cause for linear abraded bruises parallel on the back of each knee, and that's almost like mirror image on each side, or a reversed image as well.
And Doctor, while we're on that score, what potentially could have caused such linear injuries?
I thought about it quite deeply, and I thought about being struck with a piece of wood, because a piece of wood, especially if it's a cut piece, a plank, a rafter, beam, will have two edges, two formed edges that would indent the skin and cause a linear kind of abraded bruise. But I think that from that schoolboy prank thing illustration, I think that's less likely than being strung upon a structure, whether it's a beam or what sort of beam. Usually it's a piece of wood strung by the backs of the knees, so that the legs and feet dangle on one side and the body dangle on the other side of a beam. It is said to have been used as a form of torture. I'm not too sure if it's called the parrot's perch or if it is called the helicopter. I'm not sure which one was which, but I know the pattern because I have seen it in one case, I believe, out of this country.
And Doctor, were the injuries in that case where the helicopter treatment was applied, I think
Yes.
sometimes also known as the aeroplane treatment.
Okay, yes.
Did it also have this pattern of linear type injuries?
Yes, because usually it's a piece of wood that is used to suspend
Yes.
the victim. Yes. So I'm looking again at pattern recognition, pattern analysis of injuries. Hence, I'm going this way. I'm not too sure if we can look at photograph 825 again. 825. I think, yes, maybe the one there, just above it. Yes, yes. And you can see, I'm not too sure if it can be seen, maybe perhaps close, my lord, but the injury on the ankle, as I indicated, very much like the one on the left upper arm, is semicircular. It's a crescent. It's a crescentic shape. Thank you very much. Crescentic shape. You can see it. It's a shorter crescent, but it's clearly curved, and that's a localized pattern. And I'd like to think that it's a surface or structure, or an object with a curved edge, that caused that. I think that, Lord, covers most of the visible injuries.
Doctor, while we're on that particular injury, would such an injury have affected the ability of the deceased to stand up and walk?
Yes, that would be very painful. There is delicate bones, ligaments, and nerves, particularly in that region. It's a plexus of nerves and ligaments and tendons, very complex to manage the various movements of that leg. That would have been painful, difficult to stand and also walk. Difficult to stand and walk, yes.
Thank you. Before we conclude the overview of the injuries, am I correct in saying that Professor Gordon failed to reflect, at least in respect of the front and rear views in figures 4 and 5,
Yes.
some 5 injuries? And just to sum up, those would be, looking at figure 4, the front view, the bruise on the left arm.
Yes,
Not
that's
recorded.
correct.
Then moving to the rear view, the
Also, on the... Yes, sorry, go ahead. Rear
Yeah.
view, yes.
then on the rear view, the cluster behind the left shoulder, 2 abrasions and a fine pattern imprint of fine petechial hemorrhages.
Correct.
And then moving down to the left leg,
Oh, right mid-back first.
sorry,
The right mid-back.
right mid-back. Are those the 2 small linear abrasions?
That's right. Also not recorded by Prof. Gordon. That's the third one.
Plus 3 transverse linear abrasions in a line.
Yes, that's right.
And then just moving down on the right arm, that bruise on the forearm, not recorded.
That's right. That's 4.
And then 5 on the left leg, the linear abrasions, which we've just been discussing.
Correct. 6.
So that's a total of 5. Well, I suppose if you were to count them individually, there'd be multiple injuries, but 5 areas where Professor Gordon failed to reflect in his report.
Yes, and there's one on the left hip as well. So perhaps we can add that as a 6.
And that, if we turn to figures 6 and 7 on page 5, starting with figure 6, as you say, on the hip, that abraded bruise is not recorded, as well as the side view of the linear abrasion on that inner ankle
Yes.
on the left leg,
There were 7.
which brings it to 7 injuries.
Yes.
Dr. Naidu, are those significant omissions that you would have expected to have seen in the body sketches of a typical autopsy report?
Yes, I believe they are. What I would have done, what I would do in a high-profile matter like this, any detainee who dies is always treated as an high profile. Well, it's with extra care, is done careful incisions to confirm the presence of those bruises. Where, for example, on the left hip, if he felt he's not too sure if a bruise was there, what we do is we go in and we dissect and take samples for histology to confirm or exclude that. So I believe that was missing 5 injuries would have been, it's not unheard of. I've seen it before, especially a person who's got about 50, 60 injuries. It's not unheard of, but it is of significance. I'm not criticizing a pathologist for that, but I'm just drawing to attention, I think that, yes, they are significant because they help to construct the pattern that we are seeing.
Yes, indeed, and given the patent nature of some of those injuries and the fact that some of them tend to indicate torture and abuse,
Yes.
the failure to reflect 7 injuries, certainly from a layperson's perspective, sounds quite shocking, actually.
Yes, and I drew attention earlier on to the importance of the external examination in forensic pathology cases being more important sometimes than the internal examination.
Yes, indeed. So would it be out of place for us to describe Professor Gordon's post-mortem report in this case as substandard?
I'm reluctant to state that it was substandard. Or perhaps my reluctance is because Prof. Gordon at that time was probably the most eminent forensic pathologist. He was internationally, in South Africa, he was internationally known. But sadly, I believe that there were shortcomings in the documentation and in his interpretation, which I'm still coming to. I believe there are shortcomings that don't reflect upon his stature, but reflects upon this case more.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
And of course, we're not talking about his reputation more generally.
Yes.
As a leading professor and pathologist. We're only talking about his work in this particular case.
Exactly, yes.
Yes.
It is a shortcoming there for this case, yes.
Yes, a serious shortcoming.
And it would be, yes, absolutely.
And on that score, perhaps we can move to deal with the section that you have titled Limitations, unless
Yes.
there's anything else you wish
Yes.
to...
Just one thing, and the next set of images, my lord, figures 8 and 9 that we're looking at now, is then a cutout and paste. That's not my images. I didn't create that. A cutout and paste of Dr. Theo Lawrence images of the wounds on the body, which I did not look at, I did not study until I've done my own. And I think what I'm just drawing attention is to the similarity of the reconstruction. So it supported or validated the reconstruction that I did on my diagrams, because his drawings are extremely similar, extremely similar.
And
Thank you.
To be clear, Doctor, Dr. Theo Lawrence, although I think that might be a spelling mistake, but we'll double check. I think it might be Lawrence.
Yes.
He was instructed by the family to prepare that. So it was
Okay.
a sketch is done on behalf of the family.
Thank you. So,
If there's nothing further on the sketches, perhaps we can move to your section dealing with limitations.
yes. Thank you, my lord. The limitations on page 6 of my report simply talk about limitations in the lack of the original own sketches, if there were, and a limited number of own photographs taken at the autopsy in optimal settings of light, resolution and preparation. But that limitation now about is not something, it's probably the effect of the 44 years that have passed, and the loss of material possibly will account for that limitation in the lack of the original autopsy photographs. The second limitation is that the lesions in the autopsy report are grouped together in broad clusters with lack of clear detail. And whilst Prof. Gordon's descriptions may be considered acceptably adequate if it was a motor vehicle accident or a normal kind of traumatic death, or an ordinary, regular kind of traumatic death, a death in detention, especially a political detainee, would have called for careful attention to individual wounds and pattern recognition after that. So I felt that there was a shortcoming in the lack of clear detail and description of these wounds. For example, in the absence of good photographs of the neck now, we've had tremendous difficulty trying to actually typify or characterize the nature of that lesion around the neck. All we have is vague descriptions. So I feel that was a shortcoming in this report. And then, of course, the similar kind of gap in detail in the oral testimony about the precise nature and the appearances and the dimensions of the ligature around the neck. It didn't come out in the testimony, the medical testimony. Really, it didn't come out fully in that. And I think I need to mention that it is. I feel that there is not unusual for that stage 44 years ago. There is that heavy weight of importance placed on histology. It's out of sync and out of focus, but that was the nature of the this novel histology bit 44 years ago. It was considered to be, wow, something new, something really good. But in retrospect and in hindsight now, we know that histology has a good place, but we now know its limitations. And I think then the limitations were not really appreciated. So a lot more time was spent on histology than on the wound description and the recognition of patterns, for example.
Thank you. While we're dealing with shortcomings of the first autopsy and death scene examination, when studying the police photographs
Yes.
of the death scene and autopsy, did you get a sense that these were taken under the guidance of a pathologist or not?
No, I would have liked to have had careful directed views of the ligature. And I feel that this was just left, right, and center, front, back, sides, pictures of the deceased hanging. It was just taken like they would normally take a scene photograph. Prof. Gordon actually mentions in his testimony, in his old testimony, that once he takes the temperature, which is an anal temperature taken by, forgive me for this, my lord, a rectal temperature, and then he takes it, he steps back and he doesn't do anything, allowing the police to do the photographs. So I don't think he was directing these photographs.
And ideally speaking, he should have been.
Yes, he should have been. We should have asked that he take his own photographs as well.
And if he didn't have his own camera, then he should have directed the police as to what photographs ought to have been taken.
That would have been acceptable too, yes.
Dr. Naidu, did you get the impression that the autopsy that was carried out later in the morning, was it rushed in any way? Did it have to happen simply hours after the discovery?
I believe it was rushed. I always, in fact, in my experience, I was a fourth professor after Gordon at Durban, and during my tenure in that time, I had good relations with every sector. The Muslim fraternity, with their need to have the body the same day, also was somebody I engaged with. And there were many occasions with deaths like this in which we would simply call up the Muslim Burial Council and say, listen, in this case, you need to give us 2 days. And there would be complete understanding. I believe this case should have been held over until good investigation of the scene was made, and a family, at the very least, the family asked if they wished to have their own pathologist attend.
And on that score, the evidence is silent on that fact, whether the family were invited to send their own pathologist. So the autopsy, the post-mortem, went ahead without any family representation present.
Yes. In fact, I need to explain that was the manner of that day. By the time I was head of department here, we had a different, more human rights-based approach, of necessity anyway, in which we said, let the body be identified first by the family. Let us meet with the family before we set the date for the autopsy. But in those days, with the police, and being police, I need to actually mention, police practice was very rigid, very regimental, and it was critical to tick off all the cases for the day and have an empty fridge. That was more important before the end of day parade than any other community-based consideration. So the regimental police practice was call up the professor, and his team of doctors to say, okay, there's 6 cases for today, they're all on the table, please come and start them.
Yes, now that certainly was an unfortunate practice in those days.
Yes.
But the evidence on record is that clearly the family would have appreciated the opportunity to have their own medical expert present. And indeed, as we're aware, during the course of that day, they scrambled to find a doctor to assist them. And they eventually found Dr. Biggs, an orthopedic surgeon,
yes,
who then examined the body at the house at 5:40 p.m. that
yes.
same evening. Turning to the next potential shortcoming, there is some reference in the post-mortem report at page 758, to a subcutaneous investigation. But I wanted to find out from you, Doctor, but maybe first take a look at page 758. And actually it's towards the bottom of the page.
Yes.
My Lord, that's Annexure A of the post-mortem report.
Yeah.
And there is reference in the last paragraph, which reads in part, apart from an area of bruising of the subcutaneous tissues below the inner aspect of the right side of the mandible, and a small zone of bruising in the subcutaneous tissue over the middle of the anterior border. He goes on to say no other bruises of the subcutaneous tissues and various other places were observed. So my question is, was there any subcutaneous skin flap dissections done to look for concealed bruising?
I looked for that to see if he did the special dissection technique. There's no mention of it, but I have very little doubt that Professor Gordon, at this stage of his career, he was close to retirement at that stage, had omitted to do a special dissection of the neck, because he was one of the pioneers of neck injury examination at that time. So I have no doubt that he used a special dissection technique, although it's not mentioned here. So I think his findings internally and under the microscope are not in question. In fact, I found nothing internally to question. My only difference was in the interpretation of these injuries. So
you're giving the professor the benefit of the doubt because he helped to pioneer this technique?
Yes, I admit I am.
But then why, surely it's quite a procedure to carry out this dissection. Why isn't it mentioned in the post-mortem report?
I have no real answer for that. Or one of the possibilities is that he adopted it as a routine procedure. I assume so. But then again, I could be wrong. Perhaps at this stage he had stopped using it. I could be wrong. So I truly have no idea whether that dissection technique was adopted or not.
And am I right in saying that if it hadn't been used, then it probably wouldn't have been possible to search for concealed bruising?
Yes, that's correct. Shall we say he would have identified bruises that could have been artifacts rather than bruises.
Right. Perhaps just to assist the court, you can just quickly explain what's involved in a subcutaneous skin flap dissection?
Yes, my lord. So, because we know that when you dissect the neck in an intact body after death, like a hanging where there's no bleeding, unlike in a person who has been stabbed on the side of the road, so the intact body in a hanging case is full of blood, and organs are full of blood, and its blood vessels and skin is full of blood. So when you make incisions, there's leakage, post-mortem leakage of blood that stains the tissue, and shortly after which you are unable to make out, is that a bruise or is that a bit of stained tissue? Or stained or pigmented tissue because of the staining by blood. So we've recognized that, look, a good pathologist still is, a very good pathologist still able to make that difference, but for the ordinary doctor, he may not. So we adopt the practice of creating a bloodless field. We drain out the blood from the neck. And the way to do that is, my lord, is we make an incision of the front of the chest first, remove the chest organs, and in doing that you are cutting through the aorta, the big artery body, allow the blood to drain completely. It's brutal, but it's necessary. Blood to drain completely downwards, and at the same time open the scalvarium by sawing around the skull cap, removing the brain and allowing it to drain backwards. But the forward maneuver is most important. So by doing that, and within 5 or 10 minutes, you'll be sure that the big vessels, all the big vessels, or even small, fine vessels of the neck are drained of blood, and there's not going to be any leakage or oozing, and that's when you start the neck examination. And you do it layer upon layer. So it's a specific way, layer by layer, of lifting of the tissue so that you identify not only spatial position, you identify depth of each injury.
Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, you've already indicated that the sketches of the surface injuries on the anatomical diagrams were somewhat inadequate. We've dealt with that.
Yes.
Would you also say that the description of the external wounds for purposes of determining nature of injury, appearance, age and location were also somewhat inadequate?
Yes, I felt so. I felt one had to resort to the photographs to get a better idea because the description was somewhat inadequate.
And would you agree that without the photographs taken, the examination by Dr. Biggs, we would certainly be hamstrung today?
Yes, we would have been hamstrung in this court. At least I would have been.
Yes, indeed. Can we now move to your general observations on scene? That's at the bottom of page 6.
Yes.
I think we've already dealt with the general position in which the deceased was found in the cell.
Yes.
And we have already examined photographs, and we've discussed the twisting of the ligature.
I think we've dealt with that too as well.
Yes, indeed. My only question that arises is at the bottom of that page, you make reference to the direction of the twist, which appears to be to the deceased's right side, in that the deceased twisted the ligature himself. If the deceased had twisted the ligature himself, he would have to continuously turn to his right side in twisting. And indeed, Doctor, that would have been a 360-degree
Yes.
spin or twist.
Full 360 degrees,
Yes.
that's right. I should have added that, but had it been also done by another person, an external person from the outside, it would have been a left-sided twist by the external person, because it was a right-sided twist by if it was by the deceased, but for the external person it would have been a left-sided twist.
And if it had been carried out by the deceased himself, as a hypothesis, how would you describe that physical activity in having to twist 360 degrees a few times?
In my own view, I think it's a fairly difficult thing to do, particularly because you're doing it at that low level. If it was at a higher level, it would be relatively easier to do. But at that low level, it would be quite a difficult practice. Not impossible, it can be done, but it would be a little extra difficult. But more so, and I don't know whether you want me to deal with that. I think that the condition of the deceased was something that made this so difficult to reconcile. The condition of the deceased made this quite more improbable than probable.
Right. And indeed, we will return to the condition of the deceased once we've dealt with a few sections in your report, and we'll again consider what might have been possible or not.
Yeah.
Unless there's anything else that you wish to add from that section, I think we have in fact dealt with it. And in terms of rigor mortis, we'll be dealing with time of death in due course, so we can then deal with rigor mortis at that time. So let's turn to the next section, which is titled Observations on General Autopsy Findings.
Yes.
We've already been through some of the colour photographs, and I think you've already drawn the court's attention to those particular injuries. Is there anything further you wish to add that you've highlighted in paragraph 20, that's at least of the first report?
Perhaps just in paragraph 19, just to draw attention to the fact that Prof. Gordon's histopathology conclusion of wound aging between 4 to 12 hours after death, prior to death, I felt from his description was in keeping, was acceptable. 4 to 12 hours. So, although there was another observer that may have, I think it was it was drawn to the attention that drawn to Prof. Gordon that some other, in his testimony, another pathologist had said it could have been a wider range, but I still think that 4 to 12 hours is a reasonable, accepted range. Yes.
Yes. And certainly when we come to time of death and post-mortem interval, I think we need to return to the question of histology.
Sure.
But if we can turn to what might be regarded as one of the more significant injuries, the scalp bruising,
yes,
which was described as an extravasation of blood. I do think we need to pause here so that you can assist the court to understand the significance of this particular injury.
Yes, I actually consulted with a neurosurgeon on this, at least, but the testimony I gave now is my opinion, but I did take consultation with the neurosurgeon, drawing his attention to the presence of extravasation of blood, that is bruising over the scalp, all over the top and sides. It's an extensive and confluent bruising, and my lord, he concurred with me that in the absence of a bleeding disorder like hemophilia or any other bleeding disorder, low platelets, etc., in the absence of that, widespread bruising would imply multiple impacts where as exactly my opinion had been, multiple impacts where the underlying bruising and the skin is merging with each other. So what we call confluent bruising, multiple scalp impacts, whether the top, side, front, or back. That's important. And now the other thing is that it's not possible to say how many impacts, but the confluence is a worrying thing. It tells you that there's a considerable number, but even sometimes with 6 or 7 different impacts, at least myself, I can make out the discrete positions of injury, but more than that, it becomes confluent or blending or flowing into each other.
And I see later in your report, when you discuss the findings, you do return to it in some more detail.
Yes, I return to it later in my discussion.
But you appear to be saying that this injury was not confined to just one part of the head, but in fact impacted almost the whole
Yes,
head.
on most of the scalp, most of the head, yes, with multiple impacts.
And can you just explain the term extravasation of blood?
Oh, extravasation, vasation, vasa is a blood vessel. Extra means outside the blood vessel. So it refers to bleeding from ruptured blood vessels. Extra vasa, extravasation, outside the vessels. So ruptured vessels. That's the way bruising is caused.
And in order for this extravasation of blood to happen, the scalp bruising, what could have caused that?
There has to be blunt impact. Forgive me for that. There has to be blunt impact for such bruising to be caused without external injuries. It is surprising that there was no reported injury of the face. Perhaps the face was, for some reason, left alone. But there were multiple blunt impacts, which could be blows, but it could also be impacts if the deceased had fallen against structures, especially the sides. The top, the head, is usually spurred from a side fall, unless you go somersaulting to get an injury to the top of the head. But certainly the sides, and particularly the back, and the front is often injured in falls. But I'd like to think, with the absence of any injury to the face, that this is less likely to be fall, but more blunt trauma applied and directed to the head.
We will return to that when we deal with your section on the findings. But I see you note that the injury to the mesentery was also the result of extravasation of blood.
Yes.
Can you just explain to the court what is the mesentery,
yes,
and how this occurred?
Yes. This is very important, and I've dealt with this in many cases, and I've taught this as well. The abdominal wall is a ballotable and movable structure. It rarely manifests with injury, visible injury, but it very easily passes on the force to the internal structures. And two things are possible. When you get a blow to the abdomen, if it strikes a solid organ such as the liver or the spleen, or sometimes the kidney, these organs can rupture, can actually tear. But more often than not, my lord, is that because of that movable, air-filled and partly fluid-filled space, a blow to the abdomen creates a sudden pressure wave, sudden increase in abdominal pressure, and think about someone being mule-kicked in the abdomen, where the abdomen goes and all of a sudden it's an unexpected kick. This sudden increase in pressure ruptures the weakest point it will find because of the ballooning of bowel and the ballooning of mesentery and the ballooning of tissues. Tissues are extended and stretched because of the sudden increase in pressure. The air, it's almost like what you'll get to your eardrums if there's a bomb that explodes because the pressure wave tears the eardrum. So several things can happen with the pressure wave, my lord, and oftentimes a portion of the bowel can pop like a balloon, or a mesentery, because it's a little less tethered, mesentery can tear, or the popping of a bowel at any place. It can be small or large bowel. Now, what happens is sometimes there is bleeding, and sometimes there's little bleeding, but still the effect of the impact is very significant. What it implies is that there was a massive blow to the abdomen. It can occur with a fist or a knee or a foot or heel, etc. I can't see it happening with a simple fall. I can't see it happening with anything within the confines of a room. It's got to be a blow directed to the abdomen. The other thing is, and which I can, maybe I'll come to later, is the effect on that of the deceased in being able to stand or continue to function.
Yes, no, we'll certainly get to that in due course. But am I correct in saying that this particular injury could have had devastating consequences?
Yes, correct.
For Dr. Haffejee?
Yes, correct.
All right, we will return to that when we discuss the findings. Dr. Van May, let's now move to the next section, observations of the neck lesion. And I see you have inserted a photograph. It's
Yes.
figure 10, right front of neck. We will find it.
Oh, yes.
I think it's on the screen.
Yes.
So perhaps you can just explain to us what we're looking at.
Yes, thank you, my lord. It's very difficult to work what actually happened out, and this is probably the best photograph. And one can see, my lord, if I just use the cursor here for the court, and to show, I don't know if it can be seen, what may be described as a band of constriction, band of red marks. Now, I'm not too sure if this is exactly what Prof. Gordon is describing in a particular paragraph, but I also believe if that one looks closely here, one can see short little crescentic patterns of alternating light red areas and normal skin areas in between. What we see here is a post-mortem suture. That's a stitch, okay, and that stitch would have run down the front of his chest, up to the side. So that's basically all we see. But what is described by Prof. Gordon and also by Dr. Biggs is that on the left side, Prof. Gordon described it as transverse. Mr. Biggs, or Dr. Biggs, because he was a surgeon, surgeons are called Mr. sometimes. Mr. Biggs also saw it transverse, but for a short 50 millimeter length, he found a double strand. Now, a double mark. Now, on the right side, it's a little vague. It says to be, it's said to be transverse, and I believe it was partly transverse, but at yes, it's unclear. It's unclear. I think the best thing, it's unclear whether the right side is transverse or whether it was angulated upwards. But what is clear is that there was no real description in the notes of an angulation upwards. And I think this is what is important, that you want to see in any hanging an upward angulation. But we can see that anyway, the nature of that angulation in the photographs of the ligature of those pictures taken at the scene. We can see that anyway. I think at that point, and I'll mention now when I come to my summation, why I don't think we should call this hanging at all. This was strangulation. It was ligature strangulation. whether it's strangulation or not. I'm not sure if that maybe addressed that point that you brought up.
Yes, thank you, Doctor. If I can direct you, I just want to make sure that I'm in the same paragraph in your latest report.
Perhaps I can draw.
So it'd be paragraph 27.
Yes.
On page 9. In fact, it's the same paragraph and page number in both reports. You point out that it was not unusual to find, as in most cases of such neck constriction, that there was no subcutaneous hemorrhage, that's a vital reaction, on dissection immediately under the ligature imprint depression. What I did find was of real significance is what you mentioned at the bottom of the page, where you refer to the red lines being your
Yes.
description, underlying the ligature, that there's superficial intradermal congestion and extravasation of blood due to the compression of the skin ridges, and do not by themselves necessarily imply that the deceased was alive when the ligature was applied.
Yes.
This can occur before or after recent death.
Yes. I think I might draw the Lordship's attention to that alternating lines of red and normal skin color. It is caused by crimping. If one looks at, I'm looking at the dorsum, the top part of my hand, and if I crimped the skin with 2 fingers, I pull up a fold. And that's what actually happens. Lots of little folds are created where the ligature is a crumpled, twisted garment. If it was a belt, or if it was a well-woven rope, one doesn't get that. Here, where a thick garment, like a pants leg or 2 pants legs, in that, for that matter, has been used to create a ligature. It's folded and twisted. It has lots of little crimping, and then we see these ridges. So that's what creates those alternative lines of redness and clear. Now, I have, in my experience, and I can substantiate it by what the textbook says, you can create artifactual zones because of the squeezing of blood from tissue, even after death, the squeezing of residual blood in the tissue into areas of crimping. So you can get a redness like that, alternative lines of redness and pallor, even after death. Even after death. Particularly, especially if death has occurred just a short while before, maybe a few minutes, maybe up to an hour or so.
Thank you, Doctor. So Doctor, the significance, the additional significance is that for the first time you're raising the possibility that the deceased was not necessarily alive at the time of the application of this ligature.
Yes. Yes, correct.
And we will certainly be returning to that possibility in due course.
Yes.
If we can move then to your discussion of the findings, and we'll start off with the physique of the deceased. And here you point out that Prof. Gordon described the deceased as moderately well developed.
Yes.
And you took issue with that description?
Yes. I definitely did. At 49 kilograms and 1.75 meters in weight, in height, the deceased was clearly underweight. It's very much a relative, because we all measure things relative to the way we are, where we think it should be. So if I'm extraordinarily lean, I'll call any normal, slightly weightier person heavier than I am. So bearing that in mind, and Professor Gordon was of short stature, I recall a person as a medical student, this still does not make sense to call a person where I worked out the body mass index being clearly in the underweight zone. And this is also substantiated by looking at the photographs of the deceased. He was not a well-developed person. So he was slender, he was slight, and he was lean at 49 kilograms and 1.75.
Indeed, and just as laypersons, we did a Google search as to what age for a male would the average weight be, and in relation to 49 kilograms, it was a 14-year-old boy.
Yes.
That's what Google told us.
Yes.
So clearly he was remarkably underweight.
Yes.
Let's then move to, while we're on that, the question I have is, given how remarkably underweight he was,
Yes.
for a person in his mid-20s, a male in his mid-20s, how could an experienced pathologist make such a fundamental mistake?
Yes,
How do you overlook that description? How could he end up describing him as moderately well developed when in fact he was remarkably underdeveloped physically?
I felt that was careless of an experienced pathologist. I also picked up that Prof. Gordon didn't comment positively or negatively about the eyes and the presence of little spots of hemorrhages, petechiae in the eyes, or in the lungs, or in the facial tissues. He didn't comment upon that, and I thought that was strange. I thought that was careless. I was wondering whether doing a post-mortem I think just for example, I'm not too sure what time he went to the scene, but he went to the scene at 06:59. That's about 7 a.m. and he does a post-mortem at 10 a.m. I mean, I don't know whether that allows for anything to fall in place in terms of procedure, allowing for a pathologist, because he was broken up from his sleep early in the morning, to go home and shower and then go back to the morgue. I have no idea, but I thought that was careless of him anyway, to describe a 49 kilogram body of 1.75 meters as moderately well developed.
Yes, and it does actually have bearing on this case, because it will be the submissions of the family that the police version is simply not believable, that you would have this person squaring up against multiple heavy-set police officers.
Yes.
And the evidence suggests that at least some of them were rugby players, that he would try to resist arrest and then try to resist being placed into police vehicles. It simply doesn't make any sense, at least from our perspective. If we can then move to the next point you make in your report, titled Time Sequence.
I think they.
Is there anything you wish to highlight there?
Yeah, just that the deceased, from the time of arrest to the time of death or alleged death, it was said to be 23 hours. So I just made reference to that. I don't think there's anything to draw from that. Unlike the next point, time sequence.
Yes, indeed. So
Yes.
time of death is of great significance. And I noticed that you point out that you differ marginally,
Yes.
but you say which may be of some significance from the view of Professor Gordon.
Yes.
Can you explain why you differ?
Yes, my lord, I did a separate three-page annexure to the affidavit about how I came to the observation that, or decision that I would differ with Prof. Gordon. Having examined, shall we say, at 7 a.m. in the morning when he came to the cell, he determined the time of death to be 3 to 4 hours before his examination, and that would be at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. So I looked at that, and I'm going to just paraphrase in just a couple of just simple lines what I make of this. I looked at that in terms of temperature. Now, temperature drop of the body is by far the most sensitive parameter of time after death. It's sensitive. Okay. And there's a lot of research being put into it. And it's very good, my lord. But the problem about it, it's very variable. There's so many variables, like the wind factor, the exposure, the air movement in the air, the clothing and the surface the body was lying on, the body temperature, the environment temperature outside, the weather outside, etc. All play a role in affecting that. So it's very difficult to compute. Now, but if you can, we know if we can compute with temperature the time after death, if we can do it well, it'll be fairly accurate. The problem are the variables. Accounting for the fact that we don't know these variables, that we're not there, and I'm not doing it myself, I would rather go with what I consider the use of reliability. Reliability, then you use rigor mortis. A rigor mortis is more reliable, although it's not very precise, but it's more reliable. And therefore, now, if Gordon at 7 in the morning found that complete rigidity, he found rigor mortis had developed completely and fully developed in all of the joints he described. Now, complete rigidity happens between 6 and 10 hours of death, according to, there are many authorities, but Salcott Knight say 6 to 10 hours. So say a mean at 8 hours. So at 8 hours, you get complete rigidity of the body, which is what Gordon found. So it has to be at least 8 hours before 7 a.m. in the morning. And hence, because I would choose reliability rather than precision, because of the various factors that affect precision, I choose reliability. I would say it's a greater chance, in my opinion, that the person that died 8 hours before 7 a.m. in the morning. And that's probably about 10 and 11 o'clock, thereabouts.
So, would I be correct in saying that your difference with Professor Gordon is possibly you're understating the marginal, because you're putting the time of death between perhaps 10 p.m. and midnight.
Yes.
And he's putting that death between 3 and 4 a.m. in the morning.
Yes.
So there are quite a few hours. It's probably best described as a significant difference as opposed to a marginal difference?
Yes, for this case, this is significant. This could be significant, yes.
Well, indeed, the significance is, to put it mildly, startling
Yes.
for this case.
Yes.
Because on Professor Gordon's, in his opinion, the time of death is in the hands of the erstwhile South African police, and places him on the police version in the cell, which tends to support the so-called suicide version. Whereas in the view of yourself, Doctor, relying on medical evidence in relation to rigor mortis, and putting the time of death between 10 p.m. and midnight, that places on the police version the deceased firmly in the hands of the security branch.
Yes.
Under interrogation.
Yes.
Which has enormous ramifications.
Yes.
For this case.
Exactly.
And because that is so fundamental, and frankly may end up being one of the key facts deciding this case, I think we do need to turn to Annexure A, titled Notes on the Estimation of Time Interval Since Death. My Lord, that's page 23 of his report.
Of my report?
Yes, I believe it's at page 23. Let me just double check
Yes.
the new report.
Yes.
Yes. Now, you mentioned that the reading of 35.3 degrees at 0700 or 0659 minutes at the scene examination, and that's of course body temperature, not air temperature.
Yes, correct.
That it's approximately 1.7 degrees lower than the assumed normal rectal temperature of around 37 degrees.
Yes.
Just explain to the court the significance of that.
Right. Lord. After death, so the normal temperature of the body is 36.9, or say 37, to round it off, to make it a bit simpler. The body temperature starts to drop after death, starts to cool, but the central portion of the body, measured by the rectal temperature, or sometimes what we do is measure it under the liver by a little incision if we think we don't want to interfere with the rectum or it's a sexual homicide or so. So we do it under the liver. The central portion of the body starts to drop only after about 2 hours. So what we call it is, it's a 2-hour plateau. After death, for 2 hours, the central core, not the outside, the central core body temperature remains somewhat the same, 1 to 2 hours as the time of the death, and then it starts to drop, and in the initial stage, in the early part, it'll drop approximately 1 degree per hour for the first few hours, after which it plateaus out again. So if you, in that early stage of 1 degree per hour, you can make some approximation of the time of death. The problem is the conditions, the environmental conditions, the surface, the clothing, the air, the body temperature, the external temperature. Those are factors that all, if they weren't so variable, that would be an ideal way to measure the time after death. But because it's so variable, we're careful and we worry about using it blindly. And then, therefore, I went for reliability.
Yes, indeed. So it does seem that the state of rigor mortis may have been a more reliable method of determining time of death.
Yes.
Although interestingly, and I'm on page 24 of your report, at the very top paragraph, subparagraph B, You say that if you use the same method that you described on the previous day, the temperature reading of 27 degrees at 10H23 at the beginning of the autopsy, 10 degrees lower than normal, the rough calculations would be 11 to 12 hours since death, bringing the time of death to between 10H23 and 11H23 p.m. on the night before.
Yes.
Which is roughly in tune with the estimation when you rely on the state of rigor mortis.
Yes. In this way, where I used two temperatures, I used a different system that we call Hence's normogram. It's a different method. I used that as well and came to that conclusion. So because of the variability of factors, I would just going on the rigor mortis reliability, I felt more secure about my testimony.
And in that purpose, you relied on Professor Gordon's description himself that rigor mortis had developed completely and was fully developed in all the joints he described.
Yes.
And that complete rigidity happens at 6 to 10 hours, with a mean time of 8 hours. So that would translate to death between 9 p.m. and 1 a.m. that night.
9 p.m., 1 a.m., the wider the range, but narrowed to about 10 to 11.
Okay, so that would be relying on the mean or average.
Yes,
Yeah.
on the average, yes.
And so would you then urge this court to accept the time of death at between 10 and 11 or 10 and midnight?
No, 10 and midnight. It
10
would be
and
10
midnight.
and midnight, yes.
Okay. Can we then turn to your analysis of the lividity? And perhaps you can start by explaining to us what is meant by lividity.
Lividity refers to the gravitational sagging of blood and flooding of the tissues by gravity at the lower portions of the body. Now, in the blood vessels, which are not where the blood is not flowing after death, the blood is stopped flowing but is still in the vessels, it tends to sag. It's just a simple gravitational effect. It tends to sag to the bottom part of the body and can change. If you change the position of the body, it'll sag again to another position if you change it early. Generally, it is less helpful for time of death estimation. It can be helpful if we find lividity in a strange position compared to the body profile, and they do not fit, and then where we can suspect that somebody has moved the body after death. So that's about where lividity, its usefulness ends.
Right. I think that does conclude that section. My final question for the afternoon, because we are now approaching 4 p.m., is that, Doctor, unfortunately, this seems to be yet another oversight or error on the part of Professor Gordon in failing to take into account the fact that rigor mortis had developed completely, in his own words, but yet overlooking the fact that that meant several hours since time of death.
Yes.
Isn't that quite a startling error to make?
I put it, instinctively I put it, to that misplaced emphasis on this new novel information that they were getting at that stage. And it's very much if I may say, very much what I said about histology. Their impression about histology was that it was the answer to many of the questions that they had been asking. But really, histology is useful, but there is a limit to its usefulness, which we know now. And at that time also, there was a lot of research going on into time of death estimation and using temperature. So there are books written about that, one of which I have in my own collection. So I believe, well, my instinct was this misplaced emphasis about the value of certain investigations. Now we have a different view, and we know, I think we've matured now, and we know what to give, how much weight to put on certain investigations and how much not to. So that's I think he was misguided and misled because of that. Misguided and misled, basically. And that applies to temperature, and that applies to the histology.
We just find it curious that in the errors and oversights that Professor Gordon has made, that they all tend to favour the version of the security branch. Of course, it could just be coincidental.
Well, in my discussion of my findings, I feel that there might have been, and I'm introducing this possibility, there's always a dual loyalty. And this is what I struggled with. And one of those reasons that I was, forgive me, sometimes not popular, in that I struggled with the dual loyalty, because you're working with the police and we're working for the police in many ways. And you strike up relationships with police. And it tends to cloud your impressions and your ideas about possibilities. And so that colors your testimony. For example, and I felt strongly about the fact that a forensic pathologist should be, unless by virtue of lack of experience, should be, if experienced as I am, be able to give the court an idea about degrees of force required to cause a particular injury. Even if it's not quantitative, but at least qualitative, to say that such an injury can cause a bone fracture or not. Then the court and the general public has an idea of that degree of injury. So I think a forensic pathologist should be able to give that idea to the court. Or whether a certain scenario, bundling into the car, in this case, which we'll cover probably tomorrow, could that have caused such injuries? A forensic pathologist, at least one with experience, like Prof. Gordon or myself at this stage, should be able to give an emphatic, strong indication, either positive or negative. And I feel that that's where Prof. Gordon definitely, I had difficulties with and differences with his testimony.
Thank you, Doctor. Your Lordship, would this be a good time to take the adjournment?
I think so, yes, because of time. Okay, then we'll complete your evidence tomorrow, Doctor.
Yes.
The proceedings are adjourned.
you know, if we start on time tomorrow, we might finish. If we don't start on time,